Before the sun rose over Macedon, before dust from the marching columns blurred the horizons of Asia, there was already a whisper across the ancient world that a figure would arise who would stride across continents as if they were a single field. Destiny, ambition, and conquest were woven together long before his first cry. In a land of rugged hills and iron-tempered kings, a child opened his eyes under a sky of bright, hard stars, and the world quietly shifted. His name would be Alexander, and in his brief and burning life, he would carve his story into the mountains and rivers of 3 continents, leaving behind an echo so vast that it still resounds after more than 2,000 years. He was born in Pella, the capital of Macedon, a kingdom that had long stood at the margins of the Greek world. Macedon was a place of horsemen and hardy farmers, a land of rough nobility and restless ambition. To many southern Greeks, it seemed half barbarian, a frontier realm of tall warriors and coarse manners. Yet under Philip, Alexander's father, Macedon was becoming something new, a disciplined engine of war and statecraft that would soon dominate the Hellenic world. Into this household of sharp minds and sharper swords came the boy Alexander, the son of a king who forged armies and a queen whose fierce spirit seemed to belong more to myth than to history. His mother, Olympias, came from Epirus, a land of mountains and ancient oracles. She carried within her a fire that frightened some and fascinated others. Deeply religious, intense, proud, she filled Alexander's childhood with stories of gods and heroes, with the whispered suggestion that his bloodline touched the divine. She taught him that he was not an ordinary prince, that he stood in the long line of legendary figures whose deeds would be sung long after their bones turned to dust. From her, he learned the language of destiny, the intoxicating idea that his life was bound to something vast and unstoppable. From Philip, he learned another language, one of steel and strategy. Philip had taken a backward kingdom and, through relentless reform, turned it into a terrifying military machine. He reshaped the Macedonian phalanx, armed it with long spears that turned lines of men into bristling walls of death, drilled his soldiers until they moved as one, and forged alliances and conquests that brought Greece under his shadow. Yet he was also a man with many loves and shifting loyalties. His court was filled with intrigue, with foreign wives, with rivalries simmering beneath the polished surface of ceremony. Alexander grew up in the tension between his father's admiration and jealousy, between his mother's possessiveness and pride. He saw love and betrayal, loyalty and ambition interwoven in the very fabric of his home. As a boy, he was restless and intense, with a gaze that seemed too serious for his age. Tales of Homeric heroes captivated him, and he did not merely listen to them, but tried to live inside them. One famous story from his youth tells of a great horse brought before Philip, a powerful black stallion that no one could tame. The animal reared and spun, biting at the reins, terrifying the grooms. The king was ready to dismiss the beast as useless when Alexander stepped forward. He saw that the horse was maddened by its own shadow, by the shifting darkness that seemed to chase it. The boy turned the horse toward the sun so that the shadow fell behind, then approached with a calm confidence beyond his years, speaking softly, moving slowly, until he could mount and ride. The wild power beneath him yielded. In that moment, Philip is said to have recognized that his son's spirit, like the stallion's, could be guided but never broken. The horse would be called Bucephalus, and together, boy and stallion would thunder across the plains of Asia. Yet Alexander's education was not only in stables and training grounds. Philip secured for him one of the greatest teachers the ancient world could offer, the philosopher Aristotle. In a shaded grove at Mieza, among streams and groves, Alexander and a small group of noble youths sat at the feet of a man whose mind ranged across logic, ethics, politics, biology, poetry, and metaphysics. Aristotle opened Alexander's imagination to the patterns of the natural world, to the nature of the soul, to the structures of city and state. He taught him to love Greek culture as something precious, to see himself as heir not only to Macedonian warriors, but to the thinkers and poets of Athens and beyond. Under Aristotle, Alexander learned that the world was not only to be conquered, but to be understood. Inside the young prince, these influences mingled. The fierce piety and ambition of Olympias, the strategic genius and ruthless practicality of Philip, the broad intellectual vision of Aristotle, all moved through him like different currents joining into one river. Even before he became king, he showed signs of extraordinary ability. As a teenager, when Philip campaigned abroad, he entrusted Alexander with regency over Macedon. The boy faced revolts and threats, and he responded with decisive military action, crushing trouble before it could spread. At Chaeronea, still not yet a man, grown by modern standards, he fought in the line of battle alongside his father, leading the companion cavalry into an attack that helped to shatter the allied Greek forces. The story of the Hellenic world was already turning on the decisions of this young Macedonian prince, yet the relationship between father and son was never simple. Philip, ever the conqueror, saw in Alexander both his greatest asset and his potential rival. As Philip took new wives, seeking alliances through marriage, the delicate balance of succession wobbled. Olympias felt threatened and sidelined. Alexander, proud and conscious of his own worth, clashed with his father over issues of honor and legitimacy. At one banquet, when a drunken insult cast doubt on his right to rule, he reportedly confronted Philip in a scene that mingled hurt and rage. The court became a theater of barely veiled hostilities. Then, suddenly, it was all cut short by blood. In a crowded theater at Aige, during a celebration, Philip came forward with the confidence of a man who believed he had bent the world to his will. As he walked between rows of nobles, a bodyguard named Pausanias stepped from the line and struck. Steel flashed. The king who had reshaped Macedon fell to the ground, his lifeblood spilling onto the stones. In the chaos that followed, accusations would fly, suspicions of conspiracy forever linger. Some would whisper that Olympias had a hand in it, that the path cleared too neatly for her son. Others would see the hand of foreign powers, of slighted men, of grievances long nourished. The truth remains buried in shadows, but the result was clear. Macedon and the wider Greek world woke the next day to find a young man of 20 on the throne. Alexander moved with terrifying speed. He could not afford hesitation. Rival claimants existed, noble families that might rally around other heirs. The Greek cities that Philip had forced into a league under Macedonian hegemony might seize this moment to throw off the northern yoke. Tribes to the north and west might test the new king's strength. In those first years, he revealed a ruthless clarity. Potential rivals within the court were eliminated, some by blade, others by exile. Rebellious tribes were crushed in swift campaigns, their villages burned, their leaders slain or taken in chains. When Thebes, one of the great cities of Greece, rose in rebellion, Alexander marched with a speed that stunned the Hellenic world. He surrounded the city, stormed its defenses, and after its fall, he ordered it destroyed, sparing only temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The message was carved in fire and rubble. Macedon under Alexander would be no weaker, no less implacable than under Philip. The Greeks looked upon the smoking ruins of Thebes and understood that resistance would be paid for in blood. With his home front secured and Greece cowed into uneasy obedience, Alexander turned his vision toward the horizon that had long lured both him and his father, Persia. For centuries, the Persian Empire had been one of the great powers of the world, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, from Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia. To Greeks, Persia was both a threat and a seductive example of wealth and power on a scale beyond their city-states. Philip had already begun planning a campaign under the banner of avenging past invasions and liberating Greek cities in Asia Minor from Persian control. Alexander inherited not only the throne, but this grand design. And in his restless mind, the campaign was not merely about revenge or defense. It was an opportunity to inscribe his name into the very geography of the known world. In the spring of the year 334 before Christ, Alexander led a Macedonian and Greek army across the narrow strait known as the Hellespont. Stepping from Europe into Asia, legend tells that he went to the site believed to be ancient Troy, where the heroes of Homer had fought and died. There, standing on the windswept plain, he offered sacrifices and saw himself as heir to Achilles, to those mythic warriors whose deeds had illuminated his childhood. Whether the details are precise or not, the essence is true. Alexander crossed not only a body of water, but a threshold of identity. He was no longer simply a Macedonian king dominating Greece. He was a man marching into the heart of a colossal empire, intent on overturning a world. The first great test came at the river Granicus in northwestern Asia Minor. Persian satraps, regional governors, had assembled forces of infantry and cavalry to block his advance. The river ran swift and cold, its banks providing natural lines of defense. Persian commanders positioned their cavalry along the far bank, their foot soldiers behind. Many would have waited for a better crossing, but Alexander understood the psychological battlefield as well as the physical one. To delay might embolden the enemy and sap his own soldiers' confidence. He drove his cavalry straight into the river, water churning around the horses, legs, arrows, and javelins hissing through the air. Emerging up the slippery far bank under fire, his men engaged in a furious melee. The Persians fought hard, but the Macedonian companion, cavalry, and phalanx pressed with relentless discipline. Amid the chaos, Alexander himself, in gleaming armor, spear in hand, plunged into the thick of combat. His helmet was knocked askew, his plume splintered, but he survived, and his first great battle on Asian soil ended in victory. After Granicus, many Greek cities in Asia Minor opened their gates, some out of admiration, others out of fear. Alexander decided that he would not present himself merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He removed the tyrants appointed by Persia, restored or established more democratic forms, and portrayed himself as champion of Greek freedom. At the same time, he installed Macedonian garrisons and made sure that real power remained in his hands. Policy and propaganda moved together like twin spears. The next titanic clash came at Issus, where the Persian king Darius himself took the field with a vast army. The two forces met near a narrow coastal plain between mountains and sea. Alexander, advancing south, found his path blocked not merely by soldiers, but by the embodied authority of the Achaemenid dynasty. The battle was brutal, its ground soaked in blood and mud. Persian forces, more numerous, tried to envelop the Macedonian line. But Alexander focused his strength, driving his companion cavalry in a wedge toward the center, toward the place where he believed Darius stood behind his lines. The assault ripped through Persian defenses, sowing panic. Darius, confronted with the sudden threat of capture or death, fled the field in his chariot. Seeing their king retreat, Persian morale crumbled. The result was not simply a tactical victory, but a political earthquake. The image of Darius, King of Kings, turning away from the clash, haunted the empire. Alexander captured the royal family, mother, wife, and daughters, and treated them with a chivalry that enhanced his prestige, even as it bound them to his fate. To secure his rear and control the eastern Mediterranean, he moved through Phoenicia, besieging the island city of Tyre in a grueling 7-month campaign that tested his patience and ingenuity. He built causeways into the sea, raised siege towers, and engaged in daring naval maneuvers. After Tyre fell, he turned to Gaza, another stubborn fortress. Both sieges were marked by ruthless reprisals against resistance. Behind the image of the shining hero rode the reality of cities leveled and populations enslaved. Alexander was not only a visionary, he was also a storm. From there, he marched into Egypt, then a satrapy under Persian rule, but long accustomed to its own sense of cosmic importance. The Egyptians, weary of their Persian overlords, greeted Alexander as a liberator, as a restorer of order favored by the gods. In Memphis, he was crowned as Pharaoh according to ancient ritual. Along the Mediterranean coast, he chose a site between sea and lake to found a new city that would bear his name, Alexandria. In his mind, it would be a beacon of Greek culture and trade, a meeting place between worlds. Few acts show his strategic imagination more clearly than this founding, for Alexandria would indeed become a jewel of the Hellenistic world, and later a treasure of knowledge, commerce, and culture. From Egypt, he made a mysterious detour westward into the Libyan desert, seeking the oracle of Ammon at Siwa. The journey was arduous, across shifting sands and under a sun that burned without mercy. What exactly passed between Alexander and the priests at the hidden oasis remains clouded in legend. Some accounts say that the oracle greeted him as the son of a god, affirming the whispers of divine ancestry that had surrounded him since youth. Whatever the precise words, Alexander emerged from Siwa with a stronger conviction that his destiny was not merely royal, but sacred. In his mind, the line between human and divine began to blur. When he returned east, he did so as a man convinced that the gods not only favored him, but perhaps dwelt in him. He moved back into the heartlands of Persia, advanced through Mesopotamia, and met Darius once more on the plain of Gaugamela. This battlefield was vast and open, carefully chosen by Persian planners for their advantage. Darius commanded a huge army with scythed chariots, cavalry, and infantry. He had even ordered the ground flattened to maximize the effect of his chariots. Alexander approached with a smaller but highly disciplined force, the Macedonian phalanx at its core, flanked by cavalry and light troops. The battle began under a wide, starlit sky that slowly gave way to dawn. Dust rose in curtains as thousands of men took their positions. Alexander refused to fight where Darius wanted. Instead, he angled his approach, forcing the Persians to extend their line and creating subtle gaps. When the moment came, he launched his companion cavalry once more in a focused drive toward the Persian center, while his infantry held firm against pressure. The phalanx, trained to pivot and realign, adapted to the attempts to outflank it. Again, the sight of Alexander driving toward him broke Darius' nerve. The Persian king fled. This time, the defeat was total. Gaugamela shattered the last real hope of organized Persian resistance. The Achaemenid Empire lay open. Alexander entered Babylon, the ancient city of hanging gardens and massive walls, as a conqueror, but he did not pillage it. Instead, he honored its temples and priests, presenting himself as legitimate ruler, accepting their homage, and respecting their traditions. In Susa and other capitals, he found immense treasuries of gold and silver, wealth accumulated over generations. With this, he could pay his soldiers, reward loyalty, and plan even grander campaigns. He also moved deeper into Persian culture, adopting elements of royal dress, surrounding himself with a court that blended Macedonian and Near Eastern customs. Yet there were moments when his destructive brilliance flared into something darker. In Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian kings, he first maintained discipline. Then, after a drunken feast with his companions, the palaces were set ablaze. Flames roared up into the night, devouring carved cedar beams, glazed tiles, and painted reliefs. Some later said Alexander regretted this act, seeing in the ashes the loss of a great civilization. Others insist he sought symbolic revenge, burning the seat of Persian power as a sign that the old world was gone. The truth may hold both motives. In any case, the fire at Persepolis burned not only stone, but the last illusion that his campaign was merely an act of Greek justice. It had become something else, a whirlwind consuming all before it. Darius fled eastward, pursued by an enemy who would not let him vanish into the horizon. Alexander chased him through Media, Parthia, and beyond, across high plateaus and through narrow passes. The once mighty king of kings became a hunted man. In the end, Darius was betrayed by his own satraps, arrested, and stabbed, left to die in a wagon. When Alexander came upon the corpse, the last Achaemenid ruler already lay still, staring at a sky that no longer belonged to him. Some say Alexander covered the body with his own cloak and ordered royal burial rites, wanting to present himself not as destroyer, but as successor. Yet in that moment, with his primary enemy gone, he stood at a strange crossroad. He had taken the empire he had set out to conquer. Asia lay under his feet, but his army did not turn back toward Macedon. Instead, he looked further east. In the highlands of Bactria and Sogdia, regions that correspond to parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, Alexander faced a different kind of war. These were lands of sharp mountains, deep valleys, and fierce tribes that did not submit easily to distant authority. Unlike the pitched battles against Persian armies on open plains, here he confronted guerrilla resistance, sudden raids, and fortresses on seemingly impregnable cliffs. He founded cities, leaving garrisons behind, and pushed his men through extreme cold and searing heat. The strain began to show. It was in these remote lands that Alexander's psychology took on darker hues. He began to adopt more and more Persian customs, demanding prostration from his courtiers, surrounding himself with the rituals of Eastern kingship. He married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman of striking beauty, uniting himself to the local elite. Some of his Macedonian companions bristled at these changes, feeling their hard upstart king slipping into the role of a distant, semi-divine monarch. Tensions grew. When Clitus the Black, a veteran officer who had once saved Alexander's life in battle, openly criticized his adoption of foreign ways and flattered divine titles, the confrontation escalated over wine and wounded pride. In a fit of rage, Alexander snatched a spear and killed Clitus with his own hand. The horror of this act, the murder of a man who had been like an uncle, plunged him into hours of anguished remorse. Yet the deed could not be undone. Blood was beginning to stain not only foreign soil, but the intimate circle of his friendships. In Sogdia, he confronted a tribal leader named Oxyartus and besieged a fortress perched on a vertiginous crag, thought to be unconquerable. He sent climbers up the sheer rock faces at night, their hands bleeding, their feet slipping, until they appeared on the heights like ghosts. The defenders, believing the feat impossible, surrendered. Alexander took Oxyartes' family into his protection and later married Roxana, weaving personal relationships into political strategy. Yet for all his charisma and marriages, the resistance in these highlands dragged on, tying down men and exhausting supplies. Some Macedonians wondered if the world had become an endless chain of campaigns without a clear horizon. Even as he fought in Central Asia, his gaze turned still further east. Tales of vast lands and rich kingdoms in India reached his ears, and the old hunger rose again. He would follow the great river valleys and challenge the unknown. When he crossed into the Punjab, he found new enemies and new wonders. The climate was different, the monsoon rains torrential, the rivers wide and unruly. At the Hydaspes River, he faced King Porus, a local ruler who brought to battle something the Macedonians had never encountered in such numbers: war elephants. The morning of the battle was heavy with mist and tension. Alexander's army, well drilled and experienced, had to find a way to cross the flooded river under enemy observation. Through deception and night marches, he managed to ferry a part of his force across at a distance, catching Porus in a pincer. When the armies met, the battlefield shook under the weight of elephants advancing, trumpeting, their tusks capped with iron, their backs carrying archers and spearmen. Horses, unaccustomed to the sight and smell, panicked. Macedonian lines threatened to buckle under the living walls of flesh and tusks. Yet discipline and adaptability prevailed. Alexander directed his cavalry and light infantry to harass the flanks, targeting the mahats, the drivers, unsettling the elephants. Arrows and javelins found their marks. Some elephants, maddened by pain and fear, turned back through their own ranks, trampling those they had been meant to protect. The Macedonian phalanx, adjusting formation, pressed forward. The battle was long and bloody, with the rain turning the ground to mud and mixing with blood into a red mire. In the end, Alexander prevailed, impressed by the courage and stature of Porus. The encounter left him with a respect for Indian valor and an awareness that he had reached a realm not easily subdued. After Hydaspes, Alexander's army, though victorious, had reached its breaking point. His men had followed him for years and thousands of miles, away from their homes, over deserts and mountains, through endless battles. They had crossed the known world from west to east. Now talk of further campaigns deeper into India, where even more powerful kingdoms were rumored to lie, filled them not with excitement, but with dread. They saw not glory, but an endless road. At the Hephaestion River, when Alexander called them to press on, a murmur of resistance rose. The men, hardened veterans who had faced every terror, now refused. They stood in silent solidarity, their eyes reflecting exhaustion and quiet defiance. For the first time, Alexander confronted a frontier he could not cross by force, the collective will of his army. He withdrew to his tent, brooding, torn between rage and sorrow. Days passed. Then, at last, he chose to yield. He offered sacrifices, as if honoring a god of the river who barred his way and announced that they would turn back. In that moment, the man who had seemed unstoppable met the limit of human endurance. It was a turning point inside his soul as much as in geography. The world beyond the Hephaestus would remain unconquered by Macedonian spears, but in stories, it would become part of his imagined empire. The return journey was no simple retracing of steps. Alexander chose a route that would test his army to the edge of survival. Part of his forces sailed down the Indus and along the coast, charting unknown waters. Another part followed him overland through the Gedrosian desert, a wasteland of sand, searing heat, and deadly thirst. The decision to cross Gedrosia has been questioned by historians for centuries. Perhaps it was to emulate and surpass the legendary hardships of other conquerors. Perhaps it was a miscalculation of supplies and local conditions. Whatever the cause, the effect was brutal. Men collapsed under the burning sun, tongues swollen, lips cracked. Water holes turned out to be dry or poisoned. Caravan animals died. Wagons were abandoned. The desert became a silent battlefield where the enemy was the sky itself. Alexander shared the suffering, refusing water when there was not enough for his men, walking among the ranks, trying to keep order. But even his presence could not banish the merciless hunger of the land. Many perished anonymous and unrecorded, their bones left the shifting dunes. When at last the survivors stumbled out of that inferno, they carried in their eyes the memory of a torment as terrible as any clash of armies. The Gedrosian march left scars not only on the body of Alexander's forces, but on his reputation, revealing a leader willing to push his men into extremes that hovered at the edge of madness. Back in the more settled lands of his empire, Alexander tried to knit together the vast territory he had taken. In Susa, he staged a mass marriage ceremony, uniting scores of his officers with noble women from Persian families. He himself took additional wives, including women of royal Persian blood. He hoped that such unions would bind Macedonians and Persians into a single ruling elite, fusing cultures into a new synthesis. He enrolled thousands of Persian youths into the army, training them in Macedonian methods, and began to envision a new aristocracy loyal not to old divisions but to him. However, many of his Macedonian soldiers resented these moves. They saw their king surrounded by foreign customs, draped in Eastern robes, demanding deep prostrations, replacing some of his old companions with newcomers. The old camaraderie of the campaign tent was giving way to the etiquette of a court. Mutters of discontent turned into open unrest when it seemed their privileges and pay were threatened. Alexander responded with a mix of concessions and harshness, dismissing some, making examples of others. The unity that had driven his conquests was fraying under the strain of success. In the midst of this, a personal blow struck him harder than any spear. Hephaestion, his closest friend and companion since youth, the man who had ridden with him through every triumph and hardship, fell ill and died suddenly in Ecbatana. The loss shattered Alexander. He had shared his dreams, his counsels, his campaigns with this one soul more intimately than with any other. Hephaestion's death tore open a void that no victory could fill. Alexander plunged into grief, weeping, fasting, cutting his hair, ordering extravagant honors and monuments. Cities were commanded to honor his fallen companion with heroic rites. In his mourning, some saw not only sorrow, but an edge of frenzy, as if a part of his own identity had been torn away. After Hephaestion's death, something in Alexander seemed to tilt toward darkness. He threw himself into new plans, speaking of campaigns in Arabia, of naval explorations, of further embellishments to his capital at Babylon. But beneath the surface, there were signs of weariness and disillusion. The empire was stretched, its administration fragile. Satraps in distant regions abused their power, and Alexander alternated between acts of clemency and sudden executions. The line between justice and paranoia blurred. Old companions recalled the simpler days when their king had eaten beside them in rough camps. Now they found themselves navigating the dangerous currents of a royal court where a wrong word could end a life. In the summer of the year 323 before Christ, in Babylon, Alexander prepared grand plans. The city, with its broad streets and towering walls, its processional avenues and ziggurats, had become a central node of his envisioned world empire. There were ships being assembled, new weapons designed, routes considered. Then, in the midst of feasts and councils, he fell ill. Fevers burned, weakness spread. He was still in his early 30s, a man whose physical vigor had carried him across continents. The suddenness of the sickness shocked those around him. Some accounts speak of a lingering 10 or 12 days, with pain, loss of speech, and fluctuations between hope and despair. Others hint at more sinister possibilities, whispers of poison. Theories about his death would multiply. Some suspected malarial fever, others typhoid or complications from old wounds and exhaustion. A few murmured about conspirators, men who saw in his endless ambition the ruin of their own hopes, perhaps slipping a deadly draught into his wine. The truth is shrouded in the mists of time. What remains clear is that Alexander, the man who had seemed unstoppable on the battlefield, lay on a bed in Babylon, surrounded by anxious generals and attendants, his body giving way. Some say he struggled to speak, to indicate his wishes for succession. In the confusion, his words were interpreted differently by different ears. When he finally slipped from this world, a silence fell heavy over the city and the empire beyond. His body, embalmed and placed in a magnificent coffin, would itself become an object of contention in the years that followed. Routes were planned to bring him home to Macedon, but Ptolemy, one of his generals, hijacked the procession and eventually installed the remains in Egypt, where Alexander's tomb would become a site of pilgrimage and mystery until it vanished from recorded history. Even his corpse could not rest in a single, uncontested place. His empire, like his funeral procession, would be diverted from any smooth path. In the vacuum left by his death, the generals who had ridden with him, the Diadochi, turned from comrades into competitors. There was no clear adult heir. Roxana was pregnant, and in time a son would be born, Alexander IV. But a child could not rule such a tempestuous domain, unaided. Philip Aridaeus, his half-brother, was mentally impaired and easily manipulated. The commanders carved out spheres of influence, at first under the guise of guardianship, then increasingly as sovereigns in their own right. Wars of succession erupted. The once unified empire splintered into kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid, Macedon, and others. Blood flowed between former brothers in arms as they fought over the fragments of his legacy. Yet even as political unity disintegrated, something deeper remained. In the wake of Alexander's whirlwind, Greek language and culture spread across the Near East and into Egypt and parts of India. The Hellenistic world took shape, a vast cultural zone where Greek ideas mingled with Eastern traditions, where cities with Greek-style institutions stood far from the Aegean, where philosophers, traders, artisans, and soldiers moved along routes that had once been the paths of his armies. Alexandria in Egypt grew into a metropolis of libraries, temples, and markets, a place where scholars collected the wisdom of many peoples. Other cities he founded, some still bearing his name in altered forms, became enduring outposts of this fusion. The military innovations he championed, the use of heavy cavalry in conjunction with disciplined infantry, the emphasis on speed, surprise, and bold maneuver, would influence warfare for generations. Generals studied his campaigns, seeking to imitate his ability to read terrain and enemy psychology. Yet beyond tactics, his image as a figure who reached beyond normal human limits haunted the imagination of later ages. To Romans, he was a benchmark against whom their own conquerors might be measured. To medieval writers, he became a hero of romances, clothed in fantastical adventures. To Islamic scholars, he appeared in legendary guise, a two-horned wanderer at the edges of the world. Painters, poets, and philosophers across cultures grappled with his story, seeing in it the brilliance and danger of unbounded ambition. The man himself, had he been able to look across time, might have recognized the pattern. From his earliest days, his identity was woven with myth. He had sought omens at Troy, answers at Siwa, confirmation in the faces of conquered peoples who hailed him as liberator, as king, as something more. In his rise, we see the intoxicating lure of destiny. In his conquests, the splendor and cruelty of empire. In his later years, the corrosion of power on the soul. He loved glory with a hunger that devoured sleep and comfort. He could inspire loyalty that bordered on worship, and yet he could also destroy those closest to him in fits of rage. He admired Greek theater and philosophy, yet he burned cities and took lives without number. He founded centers of learning and ordered massacres. His story is a tapestry of brilliance and shadow. What remains today is not the political structure of his empire, long since dissolved into dust and new forms, but the enduring question his life poses. How far can one human life reach? What happens to the mind and heart of a person who strides so far beyond ordinary limits? In Alexander, we see a boy shaped by the competing loves of his parents, by the sharp mind of Aristotle, by the pounding hooves of Bucephalus. We see a youth on battlefields of Greece, a young king standing over the body of Philip, a conqueror crossing the Hellespont with eyes burning toward the east. We see him at Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, at the gates of Babylon, in the palaces of Persepolis, lit by flames. We see him in Bactria and Sogdia, surrounded by mountains and whispers. In India, watching elephants charge through rain. We see him trudging through the sands of Gedrosia, weeping over Hephaestion's body, lying fevered in Babylon while the world waits. He died young, yet he lived with a velocity that made his 32 years echo like centuries. The map of the world is still marked by his passage, in city names, in cultural currents, in stories whispered across civilizations. To some, he is a hero. To others, a tyrant. To all, a reminder that human genius and human destructiveness can dwell in the same heart. In the end, Alexander the Great is not simply a chapter in a history book, but a mirror in which we see magnified the dreams and dangers that live in ambition itself. His empire fractured, but his legend did not. It broke free of borders and marched on into time, a thing of light and shadow that will not easily fade.